Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Kingsmen Sports Podcast. We got our first of two brand new guests this week. Tyler Herger hopping on as well. He's got his own podcast on Eli Sports Network, Bump and Run. You can catch it. It's all about golf, so make sure you check that out as well. Tyler, thanks for hopping on. We want to talk about the big merger going on between the PGA Tour and LIV Golf. Golf, one of those niche sports that is going to be featured on the podcast this week. So obviously we've all seen the big news. We kind of remember a few years back hearing about the LIV Tour being started, Saudi funded. Can you kind of explain a little bit about what the merger is and why it's such a big deal?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you for having me on. And you hit it right on the head, right out of the gate, that LIV Golf, it's funded by the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, which I'll be referring to as either the PIF or the PIF. And they have their commissioner, who is golf legend Greg Norman. And he actually had this idea in the 90s when Greg was playing, and he was a very dominant player and world number one. He had this idea to maybe have like a traveling tour at some point, something kind of like what LIV is like, to kind of work either with or against the PGA Tour. And that quickly got shut down. And so he kind of shelved that idea. And over the last 5 to 7 years, there had been talks with other people and other countries, kind of like the PIF, where they might have this second tour or a global tour. And finally, the Saudi Arabians decided, we're going to put up the money and we're going to go through with this. And it started in October of 2021. And it's really snowballed into this chaos that golf is in. But to go into LIV and kind of what the differences are between LIV and the PGA Tour, well, one of the biggest differences is it's 54 holes for a LIV tournament rather than the traditional 72 that we see on the PGA Tour and that we'll see this week at the Open Championship. Players are wearing shorts. You'll hear music in the background. Their motto is golf, but louder. They want it to be more of a casual event, kind of like what you see on the weekend when you're playing music with your buddies, you're in your shorts, maybe your shirt isn't even tucked in. And that's kind of what LIV wants to be. They want to be that alternate to the PGA Tour, but laid back for more people and want it to be more inclusive because golf is a very snobby sport, if you will. There's a team element, which is very big. And that consists of 4 players on each team. There are 12 teams total, so 48 players compete on LIV. And so they take the 3 best scores of each round and add them all up, and whoever has the best score, they win a cash prize. The individual tournament, that still goes on in conjunction with the team tournament. Individual winner, they end up getting a big monetary prize as well. And they play all over the world. This is a traveling tour. They're playing in 7 different countries among their 14 event schedule. So they're going all over the place. They were in Australia. They recently were in England. They have a bunch of events in the United States. So they're going all over the globe. And that's something that they're really trying to do that the PGA Tour doesn't do. PGA Tour typically stays in North America. Another huge difference is that the LIV players are all under contract. So the PGA Tour players, they don't have contracts. So that's why players like Tiger Woods, who is nursing his injuries, he doesn't have to show up every week, even though he's hurt. He can show up whenever he wants. Whereas on LIV, you must play in all 14 events, barring injury, of course, to fulfill part of your contractual obligations. And another one is when, let's say you're sponsored by, Nike, and you're sponsored to wear their hat, their shoes, and their clothes, and you have the Nike shirt right here. You have to, when that deal is done, you can't re-up on that deal. You must wear the LIV uniforms that each team wears. So it's a little bit different. Like you see, guys in the same clothes, whereas every week on the PGA Tour, it's, visually different. You see like a guy like Victor Hovland, who has some very interesting shirts. And then a big part is the LIV teams themselves. They're actually 25% owned by the playing captains. And that is another way that these captains can make money and cash in. So there's a lot of different components there. Whereas, players on the PGA Tour, they have to go out and get their own sponsorships. They have to hope that Nike or Titleist or, an insurance company, whatever it is that we see filling up their shirts and hats with their logos, they have to go out and get that. And instead of it going, just to them. Now it's a team aspect. So there's a whole lot of more money involved in that. And if you want to sell your franchise, you're going to get that money. So it's another way for these players that are part of LIV or who are thinking about going to LIV could make money. And so these LIV players, they consist of former PGA Tour players, some DP World Tour players, and they even have some amateurs that jumped over. For example, James Piot, who won the 2021 U.S. Amateur and played in the Masters and the U.S. Open in 2022, rather than going right to the PGA Tour, he decided to go to LIV instead and try and cash in and make more money. So they have a lot of really great players. You look at Cam Smith, he won the Open Championship last year. Brooks Koepka won a major this year. Obviously Phil, he did really well at the Masters, came in top 5. Patrick Reed. I mean, this is a really stacked field that LIV has among many, many others. So that's kind of a recap as to what LIV Golf is. And so I'll transition into what people have been calling the merger. So this isn't a merger between the PGA Tour and LIV. Right now, there's just a framework agreement between the PGA Tour, the DP World Tour, and the PIF to create a new for-profit LLC, and they're currently just calling it NewCo. They don't have a name for it yet. And so right now, they're negotiating on to what will go on with this NewCo. But the biggest news, in my opinion, from what was formed with this new LLC is that all lawsuits between LIV and the PGA Tour are dropped. The PGA Tour reportedly spent over $50 million in legal fees, which nearly drained their entire reserve funds. And that's really difficult for the PGA Tour because they've been in a financial crunch ever since LIV has been around, because the PIF has over $700 billion to spend, and that is growing. That pool of money keeps getting bigger and bigger by the day. And the PGA Tour just doesn't have that. They don't have the money to keep going through this same process over again, and also trying to find money to, spend for these $20 million elevated events that the PGA Tour recently created in response to LIV. You have sponsors that have been leaving the PGA Tour, such as Honda, who has famously sponsored the Honda Classic for over 40 years. AT&T as well with the Byron Nelson, they're out too. So these are big name companies that have been leaving, and PGA Tour is simply not able to keep up with those funds. And they try and ask these companies who sponsor each event, hey, we need you to put more and more money into this. And companies are just not seeing the return, and they're deciding we are out. Now, this is a really big deal because LIV and the PGA Tour have been very bitter rivals since the inception of LIV. You've had Rory McIlroy, who's probably been the most vociferous PGA Tour player who's been lampooning LIV at any chance he can. And then Phil Mickelson has been a very big voice in supporting LIV. And he was actually the first player that jumped ship. And it, like I had mentioned, this reverse, of course, at the crux of it, it comes down to money, because the PGA Tour realizes that the PIF can spend more money than they can. And eventually the PGA Tour is either going to run out of money, or, they're going to run out of sponsors, or both. And then they're really in trouble. So this is kind of a last ditch effort to work together. And oh, by the way, you have the Open Championship this week. PGA Tour is going to release their 2023-24 schedule next week. Their FedEx Cup playoffs start in August, and that runs through the end of August. The captains for Team USA and Team Europe are going to make their Ryder Cup captains pick selections towards the end of August and early September. And in late September, you have the Ryder Cup that takes place. So there's a lot going on in golf anyway. And now you have these negotiations that are going on between between the PIF, DP World Tour and the PGA Tour going on all at once. It is a very chaotic and crazy time for golf.
And if you do want to check out the LIV system, I believe they post all their events on YouTube, most of them at least. So you can go check out their YouTube channel and kind of get a feel for how that team aspect goes as well. So you kind of talked about the difference in PGA Tour. They almost have a tournament every week of the year. And LIV has, I believe you said, 14 throughout the year. Mm-hmm. Are they what style are they kind of going to go with if they do become one? Is PGA going to take more of a LIV approach, or is LIV going to maybe add some events, kind of get closer to the PGA style, not go all the way? Or are they just kind of both going to keep separate and do their own thing?
So as of right now, they're going to keep separate and do their own thing. So that's why I really wanted to clarify. This isn't a merger between the PGA Tour and LIV. You're not going to see like a crossover event yet. So for 2024, it looks pretty certain that LIV is going to have a schedule. Now, what happens after that is really up for grabs. There are some courses that LIV has contracts with that are just 3 years. Pumpkin Ridge, which is in Oregon, just outside of Portland. They hosted the first U.S. tournament for LIV, which was their second event back in 2022, which it was last year, and it seems like it was a long, long time ago because of so much has gone on. But they're part of a bigger umbrella of courses, and that company has a 3-year contract with them. So we'll have to see as to what happens past 2024, but it's almost certain that LIV will have a season next year. But a big part of that is going to come down to who's in charge of this new co. Is it going to be Yasser Al-Rumayyan, who is the governor of the PIF? And does he care a lot about LIV? Does he want LIV to continue on and go forward? Or is he really just there to have a seat at the table and to try and get his Augusta National membership, which unfortunately for him isn't going to happen? Is this going to be Jay Monahan who's in control of this new co? Well, if he's in control and he's been very anti-LIV, he might just scrap the whole thing, and we'll have to see what happens with things moving forward. Now, they have said and agreed that players on LIV can apply for reinstatement on both the PGA and DP World Tours at the end of the 2023 season. So will we see some players come back from LIV trying to play on the PGA Tour again? That question will be answered fairly soon, coming up in the fall, if anyone wants to go over or if they're really content with their schedule. Now, just to talk about the schedule, because there's a big difference there. One of LIV's selling points, especially when they were trying to get players to come over, is that, hey, you're only going to have to play in 14 events a year. Whereas the PGA Tour schedule, it virtually is nonstop. There's very little off season. I mean, they kind of have an off season and golfers can pick and choose when you want to go and play, but there really isn't an off season. It's like a couple weeks and then that's it. The season starts up. Sometimes there's 2 tournaments a week for the PGA Tour. LIV, their strategy was, we're going to have less events, and we're also going to have no cuts. So that guarantees everyone is going to bring home money. There are players that played, they're going to be players playing this week at the Open Championship. If you don't make the cut, you lose money because you're paying for, your hotels, airfare, travel expenses, everything else that goes into it. So that's another big selling point for LIV. And that's why maybe LIV continues on, because some guys might be content, especially the older players like a Phil Mickelson or a Lee Westwood or a Henrik Stenson, who, they're in the back nines of their career. And if they don't want to play on the Champions Tour, which is the PGA Tour's version of, which is the senior tour for players 50 years or older, if they don't want to play on that tour, but they still want to make their money, LIV might be able to go on because the players want to. But that's going to be a question that I think we're not going to know the answer to until probably the winter of 2024, as we get towards 2025 and we really get to see if LIV is going to keep moving forward. But the team component is definitely coming in golf, regardless if it's on the PGA Tour or not. I mean, you already have team events like I mentioned, the Ryder Cup. You have the President's Cup. College, they use it. There's national champions for both men's and women's. Obviously, high schools, they use it as well. And then Tiger and Rory, they're launching an indoor team golf league in January, and it's called the TGL. And there are 6 teams that consist of 3 PGA Tour players that are going to be competing in this custom-built arena, and fans are going to be able to show up and interact with the players. They've already released that there are 2 teams. There's a Boston team that is invested by Fenway Sports Group, which has had its hand in owning a lot of teams across a lot of different leagues and sports. Serena and Venus Williams are investors in the LA team. So there will be team golf moving forward. It's just, are we going to see it in under this LIV umbrella? Is LIV going to disintegrate after a couple of years, or is LIV going to continue to get stronger? Will this new TGL just work in conjunction with the PGA Tour? So I think it's going to be probably something where LIV is either going to keep going, which I would guess it's going to. And then you'll have the PGA Tour using this TGL as like their own little team league. And I wouldn't think that the PGA Tour would take team events and put it into their regular season just because of how long of a season it is. But I suppose anything's possible. And they also have other tours like the Corn Ferry Tour. Maybe you use the Canadian Tour that's under the PGA Tour umbrella. Maybe the DP World Tour is more of a team tour. So there's a lot of options that the PGA Tour has to kind of work or at least test the team events, kind of like what baseball does when they use their minor league systems to test different rules. PGA Tour could possibly do that with their lower tours as well. And one thing that's also worth mentioning, this isn't going to affect the majors at all. The majors, the 4 majors, they're just there. They put on their own events. They're not affiliated with the PGA Tour or LIV or the DP World Tour. They put on their own events. They're all set up by 4 different entities. And so they just want the 4 best fields to show up to their events. So the majors, they're going to be safe. They're not going to be touched.
Right. I like to hear that. Majors, my favorite golf events to watch for obvious reasons. You talked about some of the players. Mainly, it really comes down to, it feels like Rory McIlroy, who, as you mentioned, has been so anti-LIV. Can you kind of talk about how some of the players are reacting, how they reacted initially when the news first broke, and we were all kind of confused with what exactly it meant, and kind of maybe how they're reacting now, how things have changed?
Well, the one thing I think that both LIV and the PGA Tour players agreed on in the last 18 months was they both shared shock. This was so surprising to everyone because there was only maybe a dozen people in the world that knew of these negotiations going on. These negotiations they started in April of this year, and they were done very secretly. Jimmy Dunn, who is he's a really big businessman. He's also one of the higher up execs on the PGA Tour. He reached out to Yasser Al-Rumayyan, and they kind of held secret meetings. Jay Monahan flew out to Europe and had secret meetings, and they exchanged texts over WhatsApp. And this was done very, very secretly. And it's probably one of the most secret deals that's been done, not just this year, but probably of the decade. I mean, it's very rare when a certain group of people that's less than like 15 know what's going on. So initially everyone was just surprised. They were like, what's going on? Let's start with the PGA Tour players. At first they felt betrayed. They're thinking, well, what happened here? Our commissioner has been saying, for the last 18 months, LIV is the enemy. We thought that they were bad, but now he's going behind our backs and is negotiating with them. Like, what changed? What happened? This doesn't make any sense. And the day that that they announced the agreement, the framework agreement, which is what they've been calling it, which was on June 6th, Jay Monahan flew up to Canada because that was the week of the RBC Canadian Open. And he tried to talk to the players, but they didn't have a lot of information. And a couple of the players theorized that maybe that it had gotten out as a leak. And so both Yasser and Jay Monahan wanted to get that interview done with CNBC and just get it out in front of it rather than having a leak come out and then they have to try and, reel things in. So they wanted to get out in front of it. And so the PGA Tour players at first, they're like, this is betrayal. Jay Monahan hasn't even done a lot of public speaking over the last 12 months. It's kind of been rare and a big deal when you see him on TV or you hear his sound. So they were kind of confused, but it's calmed down. They're not as upset. They still feel betrayed, but they aren't upset because they understand, okay, the financial aspect of this and the financial gain that could happen could be really, really good for the PGA Tour and of course themselves. Maybe that means the purses go up, which means they get to take home more money. And that's obviously a good thing. So they see the potential for this going well. The LIV players were ecstatic about it. Once they got over the initial shock, this was great for them because now this is an opportunity for them to be legitimized. Before, when it was them against the PGA Tour, a lot of people were looking down on them. You're not going to earn official world golf rankings, which is a big deal. If you're in a certain threshold, like the top 50, you can qualify automatically for the Open Championship this week. So guys on LIV, they haven't been able to earn those OWGR points to get themselves into the top 50 or top 70, whichever top it is for that major or tournament. They haven't been able to earn any of those points. So there's an opportunity for them to earn those points now. And it really kind of gives them like that verification check mark, if you will. They're finally legit because they're working with the PGA Tour. And if they're in cahoots with them, now that's a legitimate league, and there's not a whole lot of people that can look down on them. And another huge thing is the value of those teams that I mentioned earlier. Those go up because if you're working with the PGA Tour and now maybe you get your events on the Golf Channel or NBC or CBS rather than the CW, you're able to get, you're able to show more of, a certain logo that's on your golf bag or on your shirt. And it just makes those franchises go through the roof. So this is a great thing for the teams. And also, like I just mentioned, you can get out of being on the CW, and now you can get yourself to the Golf Channel. You can be on network TV. You can be on NBC or CBS, which has contracts with the PGA Tour, maybe even ESPN Plus. So there's a lot of things that can be great for LIV, but we'll have to see how things play out, especially how the negotiations play out. And this is all just kind of throwing possibilities out there, but the LIV players definitely were a lot more excited. The PGA Tour players, not as excited, but if they're able to earn more money, this could be really good for both sides.
And so, Tyler, I'm not a golf expert. I'm not going to pretend to be. You're the golf guy. I tip my hat to you for following all this stuff. Jay Monahan has gotten a lot of backlash. You've kind of touched on pieces of this. And from what it sounds like to me, it's kind of those players who are going to LIV, he kind of said, all right, enjoy. You're not coming back here. So those guys that all went to LIV got a pretty nice paycheck or a few nice paychecks. And now they're going to be able to come back, while these guys who stayed in the PGA Tour didn't buy into LIV. They didn't know how long it would last, so they didn't go and get that big paycheck they could have got. And now all of a sudden they realize they could have and then come back. So is that kind of why Monahan is getting so much backlash? And has anything settled down there, or are the players kind of still upset with him?
Well, firstly, Jay Monahan, unlike in other leagues like the NFL, where the commissioner represents the owners, and then you have like a players association like the NFLPA, Jay Monahan actually represents the players. So it's like, so the players are very upset because he's supposed to be representing them, but didn't consult with them at all. And then, went behind their backs. So they're still pretty upset with him from that sense. Now, to go back to what you were talking about, with the LIV players who went over there, they originally were handed out suspensions, and even the DP World Tour fined the players who went from the DP World Tour to LIV. They fined them $100,000, and 15 of the 16 players paid that fine. So it'll be interesting to see if they get that fine back, or what happens to these suspensions, because if they're able to get reinstated on the tour, is there going to be any suspension for those players who jump back to the PGA Tour or want to double dip? So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. But, Jay, like I said earlier, he hasn't been doing the week to week talking like Rory McIlroy has. Rory is, after he won the RBC Canadian Open last year, he, in his post round interview, took a direct shot at Greg Norman for how many wins both of them had. He has sent out, the players kind of like his pawns and, the troops, and he just sends them out and says, hey, go talk on my behalf. And then under the table has been secretly negotiating with the PIF. And that's just been very, very surprising. And, there's a guy who is named Jimmy Dunn, who I talked about him earlier. He's probably had the biggest hand in the negotiations for the PGA Tour as anyone. And he's actually a family friend of Rory McIlroy, and so much so of a family friend that he actually gifted Rory's dad, Jerry, a membership to Seminole Golf Club, which is in Florida. And Dunn is the president of that golf club. And that's a very prestigious golf club. And Rory's dad, he's a blue collar man, and he used to clean toilets and bartend while Rory was growing up. And, Seminole Golf Club members, they're, these rich millionaires and billionaires. And, you have guys even like Tom Brady, who's a member of Seminole Golf Club. So he doesn't really fit the archetype of one of those members. And that's how close they are. And not even Rory knew about this deal. And, Jay Monahan didn't give Tiger a heads up before the interview. So no one really knew this was going on. And so that's a really big reason why the trust between the players and Jay has been broken, because Jay's supposed to work for them or work with them, or at least give them some sort of heads up. And the fact that they had to find out through either, happening to watch CNBC, or like how most of us found out, Twitter, it's just not, they feel like it's not fair, and that he isn't properly representing them. But after that initial shock, like we've kind of been talking about, they've been able to kind of see, okay, maybe this is okay if we're able to get financial gain from this. And there have been talks that maybe some of the PGA Tour players would get rewarded for their loyalty, and they would get a loyalty bonus. One of the things that came out from the Senate committee hearings that took place last week was in one of the documents, the PIF, was proposing that maybe you have Tiger and Rory that own one of the LIV teams. And obviously, if Tiger's owning a team, that's going to make that team very, very profitable. And who wouldn't want to be part of, putting their sponsor on a Tiger-owned team? Is the likelihood of that going to happen? Probably not. They also were proposing that Tiger and Rory would play in 10 LIV events a year, and Tiger can barely get through 10 competitive rounds a year. And Rory recently said that he would rather retire than play on LIV if that were the last remaining professional golf tour around. So, probably not going to have Tiger and Rory involved in LIV, especially with the TGL that's going to be starting in January. But maybe other players who are a lot more laid back and who haven't been going at LIV, they might be okay with this deal. And it seems like a lot of them are starting to come around to the idea. And that's really, what I think the hopes of the PGA Tour were. They were hoping that, I think if they had to do it over again, they would give the PGA Tour players a notice of, here is what we are trying to do. Because at first sight, it kind of looked like they're merging together, but you really read into what they're trying to do. They're just trying to coexist, and the PGA Tour is trying to save itself from competing against this titan that has so much money and that can outspend them. And the PGA Tour, their reserves are pretty dried up. So this is kind of a last ditch effort. And I think if the PGA Tour would have given those players a notice and a heads up of like, this is what's going on, and there was transparency there, I would guess the reaction would be a lot different. Still, there would be players that would disagree with it, but the overall perception of it would be a lot better. And Jay Monahan would have a lot more trust right now if he would have gone that route than he does with the alternative, which was really going behind their backs.
All right, we're going to try and wrap this all up. Tyler, I'm going to ask you one question. I know it's hard to really answer this one as of right now. In the grand scheme of things, is this going to be good for golf?
It definitely could be. I think it would be. There are more positives than negatives. One of the things that I would love is for us to finally stop talking about LIV against PGA Tour. The last 8 majors, it's just been inundated with questions of LIV against the PGA Tour, and that's all we talk about. I mean, the players are sick of talking about it. Rory isn't doing media this week because he's sick of talking about it, and he knows he's just going to get peppered with all these questions. It's great for the PGA Tour because, like I said, they're almost out of money. They're running out of sponsors. Sponsors are leaving them. This would guarantee that they have money coming in, which is going to then turn money will be coming out, and they will be gaining money. And this can go kind of a little more global. Of course, it's great for LIV. They would get, the legitimacy. They would continue going on their very way if they were to decide to keep LIV going. You have an alternative league. They can continue to travel the world as such. And a big thing is the DP World Tour can be saved. And that tour was in even worse shape than the PGA Tour. And the DP World Tour was the European Tour, which way back in like the 70s and 80s, that's just where the European players played. You wouldn't have Rory McIlroy or Tommy Fleetwood or Shane Lowry on the PGA Tour on a weekly basis. They just play in the European Tour, which is part of what made the Ryder Cup so special, was because you didn't get to see the European players as much as you do now. So with the DP World Tour taking more of a global stance, and they're going to be in on this deal as well, they get saved. And it's a great deal for the PIF because they're trying to fulfill their what they call ambitious goal of Vision 2030, which is a project to transform Saudi Arabia through non-oil related ventures. And they're trying to, have a hand in professional golf and, in all kinds of sports. Yasser is the chairman of Newcastle United. We know Ronaldo went over to Saudi Arabia to play in their soccer league. They're trying to make it a tourist attraction. And what's a better way to have tourist attractions than you build up golf courses, on the sea, and you're able to bring in more people. It worked with Dubai. It could work with Saudi Arabia. And that is one of their big pillars of this Vision 2030, is to be a major tourist attraction. So in all, I think it would be good for golf. There's just a couple questions that we don't know. One big question is, what's the Saudis' end game? Like, what do they want out of this? Do they want LIV to continue, or was LIV just a Trojan horse for them to get into golf? No one's really answered that question. So if LIV is this Trojan horse and it just disintegrates in a couple of years, and all they're doing is just funding the tours, that could get really compelling. But, if they want LIV to continue on, you really could have two huge leagues in the PGA Tour and LIV kind of working together. And then you have other tours too, like the DP World Tour and some of the other tours that would end up being built up, and it can really work in this giant golf ecosystem. But I think it's good. And I hope that they're able to at least come together and get some sort of agreement, because it's just been a lot of nonsense over the last 12, 18 months of players taking shots on each other, or players taking shots at other tours. And it only affects the professional game too. And that's another thing. Like, it's not going to affect the amateurs, it's not going to affect college or high school, it's not going to affect your club championship. So that's something that it doesn't have as big of an effect on like golf as a whole. It's really a big effect on professional golf. Now, what's on the horizon is the possibility of rolling back the golf ball, but that's for another day. That would really change golf as a whole. But maybe I'll talk about that or write about that for the website.
There you go. Bump and Run. Check it out. Sounds like the end of 2024, beginning of 2025 is when we're really going to start understanding what this all really means. So Tyler, I appreciate you hopping on again. If any other big news drops in the golf world, we will definitely have you back on as well. Bump and Run, check it out. We'll link his latest episode in our description below as well. Make sure to take a peek on elisportsnetwork.com and the YouTube page as well. So coming up next, we will have a new guest, I guess our second new guest of the episode. Nick Sisson's going to hop on. There's some big MMA fights coming up as well. I'll be able to contribute to that conversation a little bit more. We'll talk about that. We got Adesanya and Duplessis coming up. We got Sean O'Malley and Aljamain Sterling, John Jones, Stipe Miocic. It is a good time to be a fan of the UFC. We'll talk about those big fights coming up next here on the Kingsmen Sports Podcast.
There are many ways for businesses to expand their customer base, but one of the tried and true ways of increasing customer loyalty and recognizing employees is to put your name and logo on promotional and motivational items. You can find a wide selection at Alderson's Awards West Printwares in Centralia. Shirts, hats, coats, mugs, pens, and more, all with high-quality screen printing or embroidery done on site. For a full catalog of items at great prices, go to aldersons.net, and remember, you will get maximum impact at Awards West Printwares.